Torith laughed, and the sound echoed through the corridor like breaking glass. "You think your soft flesh will stop me?" he demanded, drawing his blade with a ring of metal against metal. "You think your human courage means anything against Velthory steel?" Deho stood his ground, acutely aware of how fragile his body was compared to the armored predator before him. Acutely aware that one swing of that blade would end his life, but he had made a choice in the throne room when he refused to tremble before Keshi. And he would not abandon that choice now, I think, he said calmly. "That you are afraid." Torith's scales flushed with fury. "I fear nothing," he snarled. "You fear change," Deho replied. "You fear a dominion that does not need generals to conquer. You fear becoming irrelevant in a galaxy that has grown tired of war." He took a step toward the general, closing the distance between them, and most of all, he continued. "You fear that Sovereign Ysara might be right, that there is a better way to rule than through terror, and that if she succeeds, then everything you have built your life upon will crumble to dust." Torith roared and lunged, his blade sweeping toward Deho's neck in an arc that would separate his head from his body. But the human had spent years in rooms with desperate people and weapons, had learned to read the tension in shoulders and the direction of eyes. And he moved just enough that the blade sliced through his shoulder instead of his throat pain, exploded through his body like fire, and he felt blood begin to pour from the wound. But he did not fall. Instead, he grabbed Torith's arm with both hands and held on with every ounce of strength his human body possessed. The general tried to shake him off, tried to bring the blade around for another strike. But Deho clung to him like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "What are you doing?" Torith demanded, bewilderment mixing with his rage. "You cannot hope to defeat me." "I do not need to defeat you," Deho gasped through the pain. "I only need to hold you." Behind him he heard a sound that made his heart soar, the scrabble of massive claws on stone, the deep rumbling growl of a predator recovering its strength. The scarred soldier had destroyed the sonic disruptor. Rose like a nightmare given form, her many eyes blazing with fury, her jaws opening to reveal teeth that gleamed like obsidian dagger. Stor's confidence shattered in an instant, replaced by the same primal terror that his coup had been designed to inspire in others. He threw Deho aside and raised his blade. But the gesture was pathetic against the monster that now stalked toward him. "Sovereign," he called out desperately, "call off your beast. I surrender. I will accept whatever punishment you decree." Ysara rose from the floor, her hand pressed against her bruised throat, her eyes cold as she regarded the general who had tried to murder her. Keshi crouched before Torith, every muscle coiled to spring, waiting for the word that would end his life. The corridor fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of wounded soldiers and the soft drip of Deho's blood pooling on the floor. Ysara walked forward until she stood beside Keshi, her clawed hand resting on the beast's massive shoulder. And she looked down at Torith with an expression that Deho could not read. "One word," she said softly, "and my pet would kill you." Torith fell to his knees, his scales gone pale with terror, his blade clattering from nerveless fingers. "Mercy," he whispered. "Sovereign, please." Ysara turned and looked at Deho, at the blood soaking through his torn suit, at the way he stood despite his wound with the same impossible calm he had shown before Keshi in the throne room. "The human speaks of a different way," she said, "of ruling through respect rather than fear, of building alliances rather than demanding submission." She looked back at Torith. "If I kill you," she continued, "I prove that I am exactly what you claim me to be, a tyrant who maintains power through terror and death." Torith stared up at her with confusion dawning in his eyes. "But if I spare you," Ysara said, "if I exile you to live with the knowledge that mercy was given when death was deserved, then I prove something else entirely." She stepped back from the cowering general and raised her voice so that every soldier in the corridor could hear. "General Toreth is stripped of his rank and his titles," she declared. "He will be exiled to the outer reaches of Dominion space, forbidden from ever returning to the throne world." Murmurs of shock rippled through the assembled soldiers, and Toreth himself seemed unable to comprehend what he was hearing. "This is the beginning of a new dominion," Ysara continued. "One that will seek allies rather than subjects. That will offer friendship before demanding submission." She extended her hand to Deho, and he took it, allowing her to support him as the blood loss began to make his vision swim. "Earth will be the first," she said. "The first world to meet the Dominion not as a conquered territory, but as an equal partner." The scarred soldier stepped forward and knelt before her sovereign. "I will serve this new Dominion," she said. And one by one the other soldiers followed her example later. After the physicians had treated his wound and the palace had been secured, Deho sat in Ysara's private chambers with a cup of something warm and sweet in his hand. Keshi lay beside him, her massive head resting in his lap as he scratched behind her scales. "You could have died," Ysara said from her seat across from him. "You are fragile and slow, and you faced an armed Valkyrie general with nothing but words." Deho smiled tiredly. "Words are powerful things," he said, "and I have found that they work better than weapons in most situations." Ysara shook her head slowly, but there was warmth in her amber eyes. "Your species is strange," she said. "You are weak and soft, and your lives are brief as candle flames. And yet you stand before death and do not tremble." "We tremble," Deho admitted. "Every human feels fear. But we learned long ago that courage is not the absence of fear." "Then what is it?" Ysara asked. "Courage is choosing to act despite the fear," Deho said. "It is deciding that something matters more than your own safety, that some things are worth dying for." He looked down at Keshi, at the terrible, beautiful creature that had accepted him so completely. "And sometimes," he added softly, "courage is simply refusing to let fear make your choices for you." Ysara was quiet for a long moment, and then she rose and crossed to where a document lay waiting on a desk. "The first treaty between the Valkyrie Dominion and Earth," she said, lifting it carefully. "Shall we make history together?" Deho stood, wincing slightly at the pull of his bandaged shoulder, and walked to join her. "I would like that very much," he said. They signed the document together. And when it was done, Ysara looked at him with an expression that was almost fond. "I will tell this story for years to come," she said. "The story of the human who stood before my maw beast and did not tremble." She reached down and stroked Keshi's massive head. "One word and my pet would have killed him," she continued, her voice soft with wonder, and he smiled at her like she was a puppy. Deho laughed, and the sound was warm and human and full of hope. "Perhaps," he said, "that is exactly what she needed." And in the years that followed, as the alliance between Earth and the Dominion grew into something strong and beautiful, Ysara would often tell visitors about the day she learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was a lesson taught by a small, soft creature who had looked into the jaws of death and chosen, against all reason, to see beauty instead of horror. And that, she would say, was the day she began to understand humanity. The corridors that had seemed so elegant mere minutes ago had transformed into a battleground, and Deho pressed himself against the wall as energy blasts scorched the air where he had been standing. Ysara moved like liquid death beside him, her claws tearing through any attacker foolish enough to come within reach. But even she could not be everywhere at once. "This way," she hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him through a hidden doorway that opened at her touch. "My chambers have emergency routes that few know about." Keshi bounded ahead of them, her massive form barely fitting through the secret passage. And Deho heard the screams of soldiers who had made the mistake of blocking her path. "Who is behind this?" he demanded as they ran. his lungs burning with the effort of keeping pace with the Velthari sovereign, General Torith. Ysara spat the name like a curse. He commands my armies, and has argued for years that I have grown soft, that the Dominion needs strength rather than stability. They emerged from the passage into a larger corridor, and Deho's heart sank as he saw what waited for them. A dozen Velthari soldiers in the black armor of the Dominion's elite guard stood in formation, their weapons raised, and at their center stood a male Velthari whose scales gleamed like polished bronze. "Sovereign Ysara," General Torith called out, his voice dripping with false respect. "How convenient that you should deliver yourself to me. And with the trembling human pet as well." Keshi snarled and crouched to spring. But Torith raised a device in his clawed hand and pressed a button. The sound that emerged was beyond hearing, but Deho felt it in his bones, a vibration that seemed to shake his very cells. And beside him, Keshi collapsed with a howl of agony. "Sonic disruptors." Ysara gasped, her own face twisted with pain. "They disrupt the neural pathways of any creature larger than a Velthari." She dropped to her knees beside Keshi, her hands pressing against the beast's trembling flank. And Deho saw tears tracking down her scaled cheeks. "Turn it off," she demanded, her voice breaking. "You are killing her." Torith laughed, and the sound was ugly and triumphant. "The beast will survive," he said dismissively. "I need her alive to cement my rule, but she will learn to obey a new master." He strode forward until he stood over Ysara, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. 300 years you have sat upon the throne," he said, "and in that time the Dominion has grown stagnant, content to collect tribute and maintain borders rather than expand as our ancestors did." He reached down and seized Ysara by the throat, lifting her from the ground with casual strength. "I will restore the Dominion to its former glory," he declared to his soldiers. "I will lead our armies to conquer worlds that Ysara was too weak to claim. And I will show the galaxy that the Velthari are still to be feared." Deho watched the scene unfold with a strange calm settling over his mind. The same calm that had carried him through hostage situations and terrorist threats and all the other horrors that humans were capable of inflicting upon each other. He thought about the files he had studied on the journey to this world, about the internal politics of the Dominion and the tensions that simmered beneath its surface. He thought about the soldiers standing behind Torith, about the way some of them shifted uncomfortably as they watched their general choke their sovereign, and he thought about Park Jinho, about the 11 hours they had spent together, about the moment when Jinho had finally broken down and admitted that he did not want to die. He just wanted someone to listen. "General Torith," Deho said, stepping forward, and his voice carried through the corridor with a clarity that surprised even him. Treth turned, his grip on Ysara loosening slightly in his surprise. "The human speaks," he sneered. "What could you possibly have to say, little creature?" Deho ignored him and addressed the soldiers instead, meeting the eyes of each one in turn. "I am not speaking to you," he said to Torith. "I am speaking to them." The general's scales flushed with anger. But before he could respond, Deho continued. "You have served the Dominion all your lives," he said to the soldiers. "You have fought and bled and watched your comrades die for the glory of your people." One of the soldiers, a female with scars across her muzzle, met his gaze and did not look away. "And now your general asks you to murder your sovereign," Deho continued, "to become oathbreakers and traitors, to soil your honor for his ambition." "Silence him," Torith snarled. But none of the soldiers moved. "I know something about fear," Deho said, taking another step forward. "I have seen it in the eyes of those who have given up hope. And I have seen it in the eyes of those who have done terrible things because they believed they had no choice." He pointed at Torith, who still held Ysara suspended by her throat. "Your general rules through fear," Deho said. "He threatens and bullies and punishes those who question him. And you have followed him because you believed you had no other option. The scarred soldier's weapon lowered slightly, almost imperceptibly. But there is always a choice, Deho said softly. There is always a moment when you can decide what kind of person you want to be. What kind of soldier, what kind of Velthari. Toreth dropped Ysara and whirled on his troops. His scales flushed nearly black with rage. I am your general, he roared. You will obey me or you will die alongside this pathetic sovereign and her human pet. The scarred soldier looked at Daiho, then at Ysara, who lay gasping on the floor, then at Keshi, who still writhed in pain from the sonic disruptor, and then she lowered her weapon entirely and stepped back. I will not, she said quietly. I swore an oath to the Dominion, not to you. Another soldier followed her example, then another. Then half the squad was standing, with weapons lowered and eyes fixed on their general, with something that looked like defiance. Torth stared at his crumbling support with disbelief that slowly transformed into fury, and his hand went to the blade at his hip. Then I will do this myself, he snarled. And he turned toward Ysara with murder in his eyes. Deha did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh risks and benefits the way he had been trained. He simply moved, placing himself between the general and the fallen sovereign. His soft human body, the only shield he could offer. You will have to go through me, he said, and he did not tremble. Ysara led the human through corridors that no outsider had ever walked, past guards who stared in disbelief as their sovereign escorted an alien into her private chambers. The rooms beyond were nothing like the cold grandeur of the throne room, and Deho felt his understanding of the Velthari shift as he took in walls hung with tapestries in soft colors, shelves lined with books and curious objects, and furniture that looked designed for comfort rather than intimidation. Skishy padded behind them, her massive form moving with surprising grace through doorways that seemed too small for her. And when Ysara settled onto a low couch, the beast curled up at her feet like a dog that had finally come home. Sit, Ysara said, gesturing to a chair across from her. And tell me how your species learned to stand before death without shaking. Deho sat and took a moment to gather his thoughts, aware that what he said in the next few minutes might determine the future relationship between Earth and the Dominion. We evolved on a world full of predators, he began. Creatures with teeth and claws and venom. Creatures that could outrun us and overpower us and hunt us in the dark. Ysara's head tilted slightly, her amber eyes unreadable. Many species evolve among predators, she said. It does not explain what I witnessed in the throne room. You are right, Deho agreed. But we did something that I understand is rare among the species you have encountered. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. We did not hide from our predators or flee to places they could not follow. Instead, we learned to live beside them. And then we learned to make them our allies. Ysara's neck ridges rose in what Deho had come to recognize as surprise. You formed alliances with predators, she repeated. With creatures that hunted you. With wolves that became dogs, Deho said. With wild cats that became companions. With horses that could have trampled us, but chose instead to carry us across continents. He looked down at Keshi, who had opened several of her eyes to watch him. We learned that predators are not evil, he continued. They are simply hungry, and that a creature that kills to eat is not so different from a creature that plants seeds to harvest. And we learned that even the fiercest hunter can become a friend, if you approach with respect rather than fear. Ysara was quiet for a long moment, her clawed fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her couch. The other species we have encountered, she said finally. They see Keshi and see only death. They cannot understand why I keep her. They think it is cruelty or madness or a display of power. But it is none of those things. Deho said softly. No, Ysara agreed. And something in her voice cracked slightly. I raised her from a hatchling, fed her with my own hands. sat with her through illnesses that nearly killed us both. She reached down and stroked the beast's muzzle with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her sharp claws. "She is not a weapon to me," Izara said. "She is my companion, the only living thing in this palace that does not want something from me. The only one who loves me simply because I am myself." Deho felt his heart ache at the loneliness in those words. At the weight of 3 centuries spent surrounded by subjects and servants and sycophants, but never by equals. "The Dominion rules through fear," he said carefully. "Is that not what you want?" Izara laughed. And the sound was bitter and tired. "It is what my ancestors built," she said, "and it is what I inherited. And for 300 years I have maintained it because I knew no other way." She looked at Deho with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient. "Do you know what it is like?" she asked. "To be feared by everyone you meet, to see terror in every face, to know that not a single soul in your empire would mourn you if you died." Deho shook his head slowly. "I do not," he admitted. "But I can imagine how heavy that burden must be." "The other species obey because they are afraid," Ysara continued. "They pay tribute and bend their necks and say the words I demand. But there is no respect in their submission. Only the desperate hope that if they grovel deeply enough, I will not release Keshi upon their worlds." She stood abruptly and moved to a window that looked out over the city below. "I'm tired of it," she said quietly. "Tired of fear being the only language I can speak. Tired of watching ambassadors flee from my presence. Tired of being a monster in the stories that parents tell their children." Deho rose and moved to stand beside her, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her hands. "Then speak a different language," he said. "Earth does not come to you in fear, Sovereign. We come offering something else." Ysara turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something fragile and hopeful and terribly vulnerable. "What do you offer?" she asked. "Friendship," Deho said simply. "Not the friendship of equals, perhaps not yet, but the beginning of something built on respect rather than terror." "My council would never accept it," Ysara said, and her voice was heavy with resignation. "They would see kindness as weakness and move against me." Before Deho could respond, a sound split the air that made his blood run cold. Alarms, dozens of them. Screaming through the palace in a cacophony of warning, she surged to her feet with a roar that shook the walls, her many eyes scanning for threats. And Ysara's expression shifted from vulnerable to deadly in the space of a heartbeat. "What is happening?" Deho demanded. Ysara was already moving toward the door, her claws extended, her body coiled for violence. "It seems," she said grimly, "that my council has decided not to wait." The first explosion rocked the palace before she finished speaking, and Deho realized that the conversation about fear and friendship had suddenly become far more immediate than either of them had planned. The silence in the throne room stretched like a wire pulled too tight, and Sovereign Ysara found herself doing something she had not done since the early years of her reign. She hesitated. The mob beast had returned to circling the human, its movements slower now, curious rather than threatening, and the creature kept glancing back at Ysara as if waiting for an explanation that she could not provide. 300 years she had sat upon this throne, and in that time she had watched ambassadors from 47 different species face this test. The Karathi had screamed and fled before the beast even reached them, their ambassador trampling his own guards in his desperation to escape. The Melish had dropped to their knees and begged, had offered tribute and territory and the locations of their hidden colonies. Anything to make the beast turn away. The Tunvari had soiled themselves and fainted, and the Yolkith had attacked in blind panic only to be torn apart before Ysara could even give the command. Every species broke in the face of the Maw Beast, and that breaking told Ysara everything she needed to know about whether they were worth conquering or ignoring. But this human simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back. his strange flat face calm, his soft brown eyes tracking the movement of the beast with what looked almost like appreciation. "Bring it closer," Ysara commanded, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. The beast responded to her will without the need for words, pressing its muzzle against the human's chest hard enough to push him back a step. And then it opened its jaws and snapped them shut inches from his face. Crack of those teeth meeting echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. And still the human did not flinch. "What are you?" Ysara demanded, rising from her throne and descending the steps with a rustle of silk robes. "That you do not fear death." The human tilted his head slightly, and there was something in his expression that she could not read. "I fear death very much, Sovereign," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the silent chamber. "But I learned long ago that showing fear only brings death closer." Ysara stopped 3 paces from him, close enough to see the individual hairs on his head, close enough to smell the strange warm scent of him. "Explain," she said. The human was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were looking at something far away. 11 years ago," he said, "I sat in a room with a man who had wrapped himself in explosives, who had decided that his life was over and wanted to take as many people with him as he could. The maw beast had settled onto its haunches now, its many eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that Ysara had only ever seen it direct at prey. For 11 hours I talked to that man," the human continued, "and for 11 hours I could not show fear, because if I had, he would have known that I believed he was going to do it, and that belief would have become permission." He met Ysara's gaze directly, and she felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in decades. "Fear is a message," he said, "and sometimes the message is, I am prey. And sometimes the message is, you have already won. And sometimes the message is, I believe you will hurt me. And I have learned that there are times when sending that message means dying." Ysara found herself taking a step back without meaning to, and the realization that this small soft creature had made her retreat sparked a flame of anger in her belly. "You speak as if you have faced death many times," she said, letting ice creep into her voice. "But your species is young, barely out of your cradle world, hardly worthy of notice." The human smiled, and it was not the smile of someone trying to appease her. "We are young among the stars," he agreed, "but we are old in other ways. And we have learned lessons that perhaps your dominion never needed to learn." "What lessons?" Ysara demanded. "How to be prey," the human said simply, "and how to survive anyway." Behind her, Ysara heard her advisors whispering among themselves, and she knew that word of this encounter would spread through the court. Before the day was done, the human who did not tremble would become a story. And stories had power. "Your beast," the human said suddenly, and his tone had shifted to something almost gentle. "She is beautiful, and you must be very proud of her." Ysara felt the words strike her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not respond in 300 years. No one had ever called the maw beast beautiful, terrifying, yes, and monstrous and nightmarish, and 100 other words that meant the same thing, but never beautiful. And he had called the beast she, which was correct, but which no one outside of Ysara herself had ever known or cared to guess. "Leave us," Ysara said to her court, and her voice came out rough and strange. The advisors and guards and gathered nobles exchanged glances of confusion and alarm, but none of them dared to question the sovereign. And within minutes the throne room had emptied of everyone but Ysara and the human and the maw beast. "How did you know?" Ysara asked when they were alone. "That she was female." The human shrugged, a strange gesture that involved lifting his shoulders. "I watched how she moved," he said, "and how she looked at you, and it reminded me of a dog I had as a child. a female who would have torn apart anyone who threatened my family. He reached out slowly, giving Ysara time to stop him. And when she did not, he placed his palm against the maw beast's muzzle. The creature could have taken his hand and half his arm in a single snap. But instead, she pressed into the touch like a cat seeking warmth. "I would like to know her name," the human said. "If you would tell me." Ysara stared at this strange creature who stood in her throne room scratching the chin of a beast that had killed thousands. And she felt the walls she had built around herself over 3 centuries begin to crack. "Her name is Keshi," she said quietly. "And I have never told that to anyone." The human smiled again. And this time, the smile reached his eyes. "Then I am honored that you told me," he said. "And I hope that this can be the beginning of something other than fear between our peoples." Ysara wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, wanted to dismiss this human and his soft words and his impossible calm. But she found that she could not, because for the first time in 300 years, someone had looked at her companion and seen beauty instead of horror, and Ysara was tired, so terribly tired, of being feared. The throne world of the Velthari Dominion stretched beneath the shuttle like a jewel carved from obsidian and silver. And Kang Deho pressed his palm against the cold viewport as the craft descended through clouds that shimmered with an unnatural violet hue. He had studied the Velthari for 3 years before this mission, had memorized their customs and their history and their 1,000 subtle rules of etiquette. But nothing in those files had prepared him for the sheer weight of their architecture. Towers of black stone rose from the surface like teeth, connected by bridges so thin they looked like strands of spider silk caught in morning light. And at the center of it all sat the Palace of the Sovereign, a structure so massive it cast shadows across entire districts. "Human envoy," the Velthari pilot announced without turning, her scales catching the light in patterns of deep green and gold. "We arrive at the Sovereign's court in 10 of your minutes." "Thank you," Daho replied in careful Velthari. And he saw the pilot's neck ridges rise slightly in what he knew was surprise. Most species never bothered to learn their language, preferring to rely on translators and hoping that technology would bridge what respect could not. The shuttle settled onto a landing pad carved from a single piece of crystal, and Deho straightened his simple gray suit as the hatch opened to reveal a delegation of Velthari guards. They towered over him by nearly 2 feet, their bodies lean and scaled, their eyes like chips of amber that tracked his every movement with the patient attention of predators who had never known what it meant to be prey. "Can Deho of Earth," the lead guard announced. "You will follow us to the audience chamber, where the sovereign Ysara will determine if your species is worthy of recognition by the Dominion." Deho nodded and fell into step behind them, his shoes clicking against stone floors polished to a mirror shine. The corridors of the palace were designed to intimidate, and they succeeded. Beautifully murals depicted the Velthari conquest of a dozen worlds, showed their armies sweeping across planets while other species knelt in submission, illustrated in loving detail the fate of those who had resisted. But Deho had spent 15 years as a hostage negotiator before joining Earth's diplomatic corps, had sat across tables from men who had nothing left to lose, had taught desperate people away from edges, both literal and figurative. He knew that intimidation was a language, and he knew how to read between its lines. The guards stopped before doors that stood 40 feet tall, carved with scenes of something massive and terrible tearing through armies. And Deho felt the first whisper of genuine unease crawl along his spine. "Beyond these doors waits the Sovereign," the lead guard said. And something in his voice had shifted to what might have been anticipation. And her companion. The doors swung open without sound, and Deho stepped into a chamber so vast that the ceiling vanished into darkness above. Torches burned in brackets along the walls, casting dancing shadows across a floor of white marble veined with red. And at the far end of the chamber sat a throne, carved from what looked like bone. On that throne sat Sovereign Ysara, And she was beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful. Elegant and deadly and cold, her scales shimmered in shades of deep purple and black. Her eyes burned like captured stars, and the crown upon her head seemed grown rather than made. Twisting horns of dark metal that rose from her brow like the branches of a dead tree. But Deho barely noticed the sovereign, because his attention had been seized entirely by the thing that lay coiled at the base of her throne. It was massive, easily the size of a ground car. Its body covered in scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect its six. Legs ended in claws that could disembowel a human with a casual swipe. And its head was a nightmare of teeth and eyes. Too many of both arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This was a maw beast. The biological weapon that had made the Velthari Dominion feared across the galaxy. And Deho understood now why the carvings on the door had shown armies fleeing before such a creature. Human. Sovereign Ysara spoke, and her voice filled the chamber like the tolling of a bell. You stand before the throne of the Dominion as a representative of your world. Deho bowed precisely as deep as protocol demanded, neither more nor less, and straightened to meet her gaze. Sovereign Ysara, he replied. I am honored to be received. Ysara's lips curled in what was not quite a smile, and she lifted one elegant clawed finger to point at him. Every species that seeks recognition from the Dominion must first prove they are worthy of our attention, she said. And that proof is simple. She gestured, and the maw beast raised its terrible head, those countless eyes fixing on Deho with an intelligence that was far too sharp for comfort. You will stand before my pet, Ysara continued, and you will not move, and you will not speak, and you will not flee. She settled back in her throne, her finger still raised. If I lower my hand, she will kill you, and your species will be deemed unworthy of the Dominion's recognition. The maw beast rose from its coiled position and began to descend the steps of the throne, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. And Deho felt his heart begin to pound against his ribs. It circled him slowly, close enough that he could smell its breath, a scent like copper and ozone and something older than either. And its claws clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed almost playful. Deho did not move. The creature pressed its muzzle against his shoulder, those impossible teeth close enough to his throat that he could feel the heat of them. And somewhere in the watching crowd of Velthari courtiers, he heard whispers of anticipation. He thought about fear, about the way it lived in the body like a second heartbeat, about all the times he had felt it and all the times he had chosen to act anyway. Thought about a man named Park Jinho, who had strapped explosives to his chest 11 years ago, who had wept and raged and threatened to take an entire building down with him, and how Deho had sat with him for 11 hours until the sun rose, and Jinho finally let the detonator fall from his shaking fingers. The maw beast opened its jaws wide enough to take his head in a single bite, and Deho looked past those teeth into the darkness of its throat. And he did not tremble. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and finally the creature pulled back, those many eyes blinking in what might have been confusion. And it turned to look at its master, as if asking a question. Sovereign Ysara had not lowered her hand. She sat frozen on her throne. And for the first time since he had entered the chamber, Deho saw something other than cold amusement on her face. She looked unsettled in a way that suggested she was not used to the feeling. In 300 years, she said slowly, no envoy has ever simply stood there. Deho allowed himself the smallest smile. Then perhaps, he replied, it is time you met humanity.